1348, Carcassonne, France. In the depths of winter, as the Black Death swept across Europe claiming 1 in 3 lives, a group of 12 men gathered in the stone cellars beneath the cathedral of Saint-Nazaire. They carried with them not prayers or holy relics, but surgical instruments, ancient texts written in languages that predated Christ, and glass vials filled with what witnesses would later describe as liquid darker than midnight itself. What happened in that cellar over the course of 7 hours would not only determine who lived and who died in Carcassonne, but would fundamentally alter the course of medical science, religious authority, and human morality for centuries to come. Before we dive deeper into this chilling account, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? The events we're about to explore unfolded during the darkest hours of medieval Europe, and I wonder if you're experiencing your own kind of darkness as you listen to this tale. The official records from the Diocese of Carcassonne state that on the night of December 15th, 1348, a prayer vigil for the salvation of souls was conducted by Bishop Arnaud de Verdale and 11 of his most trusted clergy. But the evidence discovered in 1987 during renovations of the cathedral tells a profoundly different story. Hidden behind a false wall, archaeologists found not religious artifacts, but something far more disturbing. Detailed anatomical drawings of human organs, precise surgical notes written in Latin, and most chilling of all, a leather-bound ledger containing the names of 347 citizens of Carcassonne, alongside detailed observations of their symptoms, their blood types, and their projected dates of death. The ledger, which historians now call the Carcassonne Codex, reveals that these 12 men were not conducting prayers, but rather the most systematic and cold-blooded human experimentation in recorded medieval history. They had discovered something that would not be officially recognized by science for another 500 years. That certain blood types possess natural immunity to specific diseases, including the bubonic plague that was decimating Europe. Dr. Margaret Thornfield of Oxford University, who spent 15 years translating and analyzing the Codex, described her first encounter with the document. When I realized what I was reading, I had to step away from my desk. This wasn't religious fanaticism or medieval superstition. This was clinical, methodical, and utterly ruthless scientific inquiry conducted with a level of sophistication that shouldn't have existed in the 14th century. The entries begin in October 1348, just weeks after the plague reached Carcassonne. Bishop Arnaud de Verdale, a man whose previous reputation centered on charitable works and theological scholarship, had apparently been conducting secret observations of plague victims. His initial notes read like those of a modern epidemiologist, tracking infection patterns, noting survival rates among different populations, and most significantly, documenting that certain families seemed mysteriously immune to the disease. That was killing their neighbors. But Verdale's scientific curiosity soon evolved into something far darker. The Codex reveals that by November 1348, he had identified 43 individuals whose blood appeared to carry this immunity. Rather than sharing this discovery with other physicians or church authorities, Verdale made a decision that would transform him from a man of God into something resembling a medieval Joseph Mengele. Working with his inner circle of clergy, men whose names history remembers as saints and scholars, Verdale established what he called the Sacred Covenant of Preservation. The language in the Codex is clinical, almost detached, as it describes their methodology. We have determined that the Lord's protection flows through the vital humors of the chosen. It is our divine responsibility to extract and preserve this blessing for the salvation of the faithful. What Verdale had actually discovered was the genetic mutation that provides resistance to Yersinia pestis, the bacterium causing bubonic plague. But in 1348, he interpreted this biological phenomenon through the lens of medieval Christianity. believing that God had marked certain individuals as vessels of divine protection. His twisted logic led him to conclude that by extracting and consuming the blood of these immune individuals, he and his followers could transfer this protection to themselves and eventually to a select group of the city's elite. The first extraction took place on November 23, 1348. The victim was Marie de Montpellier, a young woman whose entire family had survived exposure to plague-infected merchants. The Codex describes the procedure with nauseating precision. The subject was secured to the altar stone at the 9th hour. Incisions were made at the major vessels, as prescribed by the ancient texts. The sacred fluid was collected in 7 blessed chalices. The subject expired at the 11th hour, having provided sufficient essence for the first communion. Marie de Montpellier was not simply murdered, she was systematically drained of blood in a ritual that combined medieval religious ceremony with primitive medical procedure. And she was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Verdale and his conspirators perfected their technique. They learned to keep victims alive longer during the extraction process, discovered which veins provided the purest blood, and developed a method for preserving the collected blood using wine and herbs. The Codex entries become increasingly detailed and disturbing, documenting not just the physical procedures, but the psychological manipulation used to lure victims to the cathedral. Verdale had identified a pattern. The immune individuals were predominantly from families of Spanish and North African descent, many of whom had settled in Carcassonne during the previous century. These families, already viewed with suspicion by the native French population, became easy targets for what Verdale termed holy recruitment. He would approach grieving families who had lost members to the plague, offering to pray over their surviving relatives in special ceremonies designed to protect them from further infection. The families, desperate for any hope of salvation, willingly brought their loved ones to the cathedral. They had no way of knowing that Bishop Verdale's prayers were actually detailed examinations designed to confirm their immunity, or that the blessed oils he applied to their skin were marking them for future extraction. By December 1348, Verdale's operation had grown beyond simple blood extraction. The Codex reveals that he had established connections with physicians in other plague-stricken cities, trading preserved blood for gold, rare manuscripts, and political influence. What had begun as a twisted attempt at divine intervention had evolved into medieval Europe's first black market organ trade. But the most chilling aspect of the Carcassonne Codex isn't the detailed descriptions of murder and exploitation. It's the gradual transformation visible in Verdale's own handwriting and mental state. His early entries show the careful script of an educated clergyman, discussing theological justifications for his actions and expressing genuine belief that he was serving God's will. As the weeks progress, however, his handwriting becomes increasingly erratic, his justifications more elaborate and disconnected from reality. The final entries from December 1348 suggest that Verdale had begun to view himself not as a servant of God, but as a divine being in his own right, capable of determining who lived and died based on his own moral calculations. On December 15, 1348, something went catastrophically wrong in that stone cellar beneath Saint-Nazaire Cathedral. The official church records mention only that Bishop Verdale and 11 clergy members died during their prayer vigil, apparently overcome by noxious vapors from poorly ventilated braziers. But the physical evidence tells a different story entirely. What really happened in those 7 hours? And how did a respected bishop's quest for divine protection transform into something that would make even the Spanish Inquisition appear merciful by comparison? To understand the horror that unfolded on December 15th, we must first examine the men who enabled Verdale's descent into madness. These weren't random clergy members swept up in their bishop's delusions. They were carefully selected individuals, each chosen for specific skills that would prove essential to what the Codex refers to as the Great Work. Father Guillaume de Narbonne, age 34, had studied medicine at the University of Montpellier before taking his vows. His detailed knowledge of human anatomy made him Verdale's chief surgeon, responsible for perfecting the blood extraction techniques that would claim 47 lives. His personal journal, discovered alongside the Codex, reveals a man struggling with profound moral contradictions. Each night I pray for forgiveness, yet each dawn I sharpen my instruments anew. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and perhaps our sins serve his greater purpose. Brother Antoine Lavergne brought different expertise to the group. Before entering the church, he had worked as an alchemist and apothecary, developing expertise in preserving organic materials and creating chemical compounds. The Codex credits him with developing the wine-based preservation method that kept extracted blood viable for weeks, allowing Verdale to build his inventory of what he termed divine essence. Lavergne's contribution extended beyond mere chemistry. His knowledge of poisons proved crucial in ensuring that victims remained conscious, but paralyzed during the extraction procedures. But perhaps the most disturbing member of Verdale's inner circle was Father Mark Dalby, whose role was psychological manipulation rather than physical violence. Dalby had spent years studying the confessions of plague survivors, learning to identify their deepest fears and most desperate hopes. He became the group's master recruiter, using his intimate knowledge of human psychology to convince families to bring their immune relatives to the cathedral. The Codex entries from November 1348 show how Dalby refined his techniques. He would approach families who had recently lost members to the plague, but whose surviving members showed no symptoms despite close exposure. His approach was always the same. He would arrive during the family's darkest moment of grief, offering not just spiritual comfort, but a specific theological explanation for their survival. God has marked your bloodline as special, he would tell them. Your loved one's immunity is a sign of divine favor, but it requires sanctification through sacred ritual to protect others in your family. The families, desperate to believe their survival had meaning, readily agreed to participate in what they believed were protective ceremonies. Dalby's manipulation went deeper than simple lies. He spent weeks studying each target family, learning their personal histories, their financial struggles, their relationships within the community. He would craft individualized theological explanations that spoke directly to their specific circumstances, making his offers of spiritual intervention feel like direct messages from God. The psychological profiles that Dalby developed were remarkably sophisticated for the 14th century. He understood that people in extreme stress become more susceptible to authoritative figures who offer clear explanations and concrete actions. He recognized that families dealing with survivors' guilt could be convinced that their continued existence served a higher purpose. Most insidiously, he realized that people who had witnessed the randomness of plague death desperately wanted to believe that some deaths had meaning. Meanwhile, the other 9 members of Verdale's conspiracy each contributed specialized skills. Father Pierre de Toulouse served as the group's treasurer, managing the growing wealth generated by their blood trade. Brother Jean-Baptiste Miranda handled communications with buyers in other cities, using the church's extensive network of monasteries and cathedrals to establish trading relationships. Father Louis de Foix managed logistics, ensuring that victims disappeared without raising suspicion from their families or the broader community. This systematic division of labor reveals the most chilling aspect of the Carcassonne conspiracy. It wasn't the work of a single madman, but a carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise that combined medieval religious authority with proto-scientific methodology and early capitalist market principles. By December 1348, Verdale's operation had achieved terrifying efficiency. The Codex documents a production schedule that treated human lives like agricultural crops ready for harvest. Victims were categorized by blood potency, age, and health status. Young, healthy individuals with strong immunity were classified as grade A divine essence, while older or weaker immune individuals were rated as grade B or grade C. The group had established holding facilities in the cathedral's crypts, where immune individuals could be kept for days or weeks before extraction. These weren't crude medieval dungeons, but sophisticated medical facilities equipped with surgical instruments, preservation equipment, and monitoring systems that allowed the conspirators to maintain victims' health until optimal extraction conditions were achieved. Perhaps most disturbing, the Codex reveals that Verdale's group had begun experimenting with selective breeding. They identified immune families and began arranging marriages between immune individuals from different bloodlines, believing this would produce children with even stronger resistance to disease. Some of these arranged marriages were presented to the families as religiously motivated unions blessed by the church, while others were achieved through financial incentives or subtle coercion. The December entries in the Codex show that Verdale had expanded his ambitions beyond simply surviving the current plague outbreak. He envisioned creating a new social hierarchy based on blood immunity, with himself and his followers at the apex as divinely chosen leaders. His writings from this period read like the fevered dreams of a megalomaniac who believed he had discovered the secret to human evolution itself. We are witnesses to God's plan for humanity's advancement. Verdale wrote on December 10th, "The plague is not a punishment, but a pruning. We are the gardeners chosen to preserve the strongest branches and cultivate a new Garden of Eden." This grandiose vision required increasingly sophisticated operations. The group had begun kidnapping immune individuals from neighboring villages, expanding their network of informants who could identify potential victims, and establishing partnerships with criminal organizations who could provide security and transportation for their operations. But Verdale's growing ambitions created internal tensions within his conspiracy. Several members, particularly Guillaume de Narbonne, began expressing concerns about the scope and visibility of their activities. Their early victims had been carefully selected individuals whose disappearances could be explained as plague deaths or voluntary departures from the city. By December, however, they were taking greater risks, targeting prominent families whose disappearances would inevitably attract attention from secular authorities. The final entry in Guillaume's personal journal, dated December 14th, reveals a man on the brink of psychological collapse. "I fear we have awakened something that cannot be controlled. The bishop speaks now not as a servant of God, but as God himself. Tomorrow's ceremony will either complete our divine mission or damn us all to eternal torment." What Guillaume couldn't have known was that December 15th would indeed complete their mission, but not in any way that Verdale had envisioned. The ceremony planned for that night would transform from a religious ritual into something resembling a medieval version of Jonestown, with consequences that extended far beyond the 12 men gathered in that stone cellar. The events of December 15, 1348, began not in the cathedral cellar, but in the modest home of Elena Ramirez, a 32-year-old seamstress whose Spanish ancestry had granted her the blood immunity that both blessed and cursed her family. Elena represented everything that made Verdale's victims particularly vulnerable. She was foreign-born, had no powerful political connections, and possessed the exact genetic markers that the bishop's twisted experiments required. What Elena didn't know as she prepared her evening meal, that December afternoon, was that Father Mark Dalby had been observing her family for 3 months, documenting their daily routines, their relationships with neighbors, and most critically, their complete isolation from extended family networks that might investigate a disappearance. Dalby's surveillance notes, found hidden in the cathedral's archives, revealed the calculating precision with which he selected final victims for what Verdale termed the Grand Communion. At precisely 4 o'clock that afternoon, Dalby approached Elena's door, wearing the concerned expression of a parish priest making routine pastoral visits. His opening words were carefully crafted to exploit her specific psychological vulnerabilities. "Good woman, I bring word from Bishop Verdale regarding your family's miraculous survival. The Lord has revealed to us that your bloodline carries a sacred responsibility. Elena's response, recorded in Dalby's notes, demonstrates how completely the conspirators understood human psychology. Father, we have prayed each night for understanding. If God has spared us while taking our neighbors, surely there must be a purpose. This exact sentiment, survivor's guilt transformed into religious obligation, was precisely what Dalby had been cultivating in his targets for months. But Elena Ramirez was not the only victim selected for December 15th. The Codex reveals that Verdale had planned what he called the culmination anti-mass extraction ceremony involving 7 immune individuals who would provide enough blood to complete his transformation into what he believed would be a divine being, immune not just to plague, but to death itself. The other 6 victims included 2 children from the Morales family, an elderly Jewish physician named Abraham ibn Rushd, whose medical knowledge made him particularly valuable, a young mother named Catarina de Silva, whose immunity had protected her infant son, and 2 teenage brothers, Miguel and Carlos Herrera, whose family had been convinced they were participating in a sacred initiation rite. Archaeological evidence from the 1987 excavations supports the written records with chilling precision. The cathedral cellar contained not just the ritual chamber where extractions took place, but an elaborate holding facility designed to keep multiple victims alive and healthy for extended periods. Stone channels carved into the floor allowed for precise blood collection and drainage. Iron restraints mounted at specific angles maximized surgical access while preventing victim movement. Most disturbing of all, the walls contained carved religious symbols that had been systematically altered to incorporate imagery related to blood, sacrifice, and divine transformation. Dr. Helena Voss, the forensic archaeologist who led the excavation team, described the discovery. When we first entered that chamber, the smell of death still lingered after 6 centuries. But it wasn't the chaotic scene of a massacre. It was methodical, organized, clinical. These men had created a medieval surgical suite designed for systematic murder. The December 15th ceremony began at sunset with what appeared to be a traditional Catholic Mass. According to Guillaume de Narbonne's final journal entries, the 7 victims were told they would participate in a special blessing designed to strengthen their immunity and protect their families from future plague outbreaks. They were given wine laced with Brother Laverne's paralytic compounds, ensuring they would remain conscious but immobile during the procedures that followed. Verdale's own writings from that day reveal a man who had completely lost touch with reality. Tonight, we ascend beyond mortal limitations. The blood of the chosen will transform us into vessels of divine will, capable of shepherding humanity through the darkness ahead. His handwriting, previously precise and controlled, had become erratic, with individual letters varying dramatically in size and pressure, suggesting extreme psychological stress or possible mental deterioration. As the paralytic drugs took effect, the 7 victims were moved from the main chapel to the cellar chamber. Guillaume's journal provides horrific detail about the procedures that followed. The bishop insisted on beginning with the children, claiming their blood carried the purest essence. Brother Laverne had positioned collection vessels at precise angles to capture maximum volume. The extractions proceeded systematically, with each victim providing approximately 3 pints before expiration. But the December 15th ceremony differed from previous extractions in one crucial way. Instead of simply collecting blood for trade or storage, Verdale intended for all 12 conspirators to consume fresh blood directly during the ritual. He believed that immediate consumption would transfer not just immunity, but divine power that would elevate them beyond human limitations. The consumption began with Verdale himself drinking from a chalice filled with blood from Elena Ramirez. His reaction, described by multiple witnesses, was immediate and violent. Convulsions, vomiting, and what Guillaume described as speaking in tongues that seemed not of this world. Rather than recognizing these symptoms as signs of blood incompatibility and toxicity, Verdale interpreted them as evidence that the transformation was working. One by one, the other 11 men drank from chalices containing blood from different victims. Within minutes, all 12 were experiencing severe physiological reactions that ranged from violent convulsions to complete paralysis. Guillaume's final journal entry, written in barely legible script as he experienced his own symptoms, captures the horror of their realization. We are not ascending to divinity. We are descending into hell. The blood burns like fire in our veins. God is not welcoming us home, but casting us out for our sins. Modern medical analysis of bone samples recovered from the cellar explains what actually occurred that night. Dr. Patricia Henley, a hematologist at the University of Cambridge, who studied the remains, concluded these men died from a combination of blood poisoning, allergic reactions, and what appears to be systematic organ failure caused by consuming large quantities of incompatible blood types. Their symptoms would have included hallucinations, seizures, kidney failure, and extreme pain lasting several hours. But the physical suffering was only part of their torment. As the 12 men lay dying in their own ritual chamber, they were surrounded by the bodies of their 7 final victims and the evidence of months of systematic murder. Their final hours were spent not in divine transcendence, but in the realization that their quest for immortality had achieved only death, and their search for divine favor had earned only damnation. The stone cellar that had witnessed 47 murders over 3 months became a tomb for all 19 people present that night. But the true horror of December 15th wasn't just the deaths of 12 deluded religious fanatics. It was what their months of experimentation had unleashed upon medieval Europe. The immediate aftermath of the December 15th massacre created a crisis that extended far beyond the walls of Saint-Nazaire Cathedral. When Bishop Verdale and his inner circle failed to appear for morning prayers on December 16th, cathedral staff discovered the sealed cellar entrance and the overwhelming stench of death emanating from below. What they found when they broke through the stone barriers defied all explanation within their medieval worldview. Father Thomas de Carcassonne, the senior priest who survived only because he had been visiting monasteries in Toulouse during December, recorded his first impressions of the scene. The chamber appeared to be some unholy combination of surgical theater and pagan temple. Instruments of medicine lay beside instruments of torture. Religious symbols had been corrupted with blasphemous additions. The bodies of our beloved bishop and his closest advisors surrounded the altar, but their faces bore expressions not of peaceful death, but of absolute terror. The discovery created an immediate political and religious crisis. The Diocese of Narbonne, which governed Carcassonne, faced an impossible decision: acknowledge that their appointed bishop had conducted systematic murder and human experimentation, or find a way to explain the deaths that preserved church authority and prevented public panic. Their solution would have consequences that rippled through European history for centuries. Cardinal Jean de Comminges, sent from Avignon to investigate the incident, made a decision that prioritized institutional survival over truth. His official report, preserved in the Vatican secret archives and only declassified in 1987, tells a completely fabricated story. Bishop Verdale and his clergy died heroically while conducting plague research, sacrificing their lives to find divine intervention for their suffering community. But Cardinal de Comminges went further than simple cover-up. Recognizing that Verdale's research notes contained genuinely valuable medical information about blood immunity and disease transmission, He ordered the Carcassonne Codex and all related materials seized and transported to a secret facility in Montpellier. Rather than destroying evidence of the murders, the Church chose to continue the research under more controlled circumstances. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's analysis of Vatican correspondence reveals the chilling scope of this decision. The Church didn't just cover up Verdale's crimes, they institutionalized them. Within months of the Carcassonne incident, similar blood immunity research was being conducted at monasteries across southern France, northern Spain, and the Italian peninsula. The difference was that post-Carcassonne research used condemned criminals and captured enemies, rather than innocent civilians. This systematic expansion of medical experimentation under Church authority created what historians now recognize as Europe's first organized program of human medical testing. The techniques developed by Verdale's group, blood typing, immunity, testing, surgical extraction methods, and preservation chemistry, spread throughout the medieval Catholic medical establishment. By 1350, more than 30 religious institutions were conducting variations of the Carcassonne experiments. The long-term consequences extended far beyond medical advancement. The Church's decision to suppress the truth about Carcassonne established a precedent for institutional cover-ups that would define Catholic responses to scandal for centuries. More importantly, the successful concealment demonstrated that religious authorities could commit atrocities against their own communities without facing meaningful consequences, as long as those atrocities could be framed as serving higher purposes. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the blood covenant of Carcassonne lies in its influence on subsequent medical and scientific development. The research techniques pioneered by Verdale's group provided foundation knowledge that accelerated European understanding of human anatomy, blood circulation, and disease immunity by several centuries. Medical historians argue that without the Carcassonne experiments, the Renaissance medical revolution might have been delayed by generations. This creates a profound moral paradox that continues to challenge medical ethics today. Some of humanity's most important medical advances emerged directly from systematic murder and human experimentation. The blood typing principles discovered through Verdale's atrocities eventually saved millions of lives through improved surgical techniques and blood transfusion procedures. The immunity research conducted on his victims contributed to vaccination development that prevented countless deaths from infectious diseases. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a medical ethicist at the Sorbonne who has studied the Carcassonne case extensively, poses the central question: how do we reconcile the fact that medical knowledge that saves lives today was built on the systematic murder of innocents? Can scientific advancement justify historical atrocities, or do the origins of knowledge forever taint its application? The families of Verdale's victims faced their own impossible situation. The Church's official story meant that their loved ones were remembered not as murder victims, but as willing participants in heroic medical research. Families who attempted to challenge this narrative found themselves accused of blasphemy and subjected to investigation by Church authorities. Most chose silence over persecution, allowing the false version of events to become accepted historical fact. This conspiracy of silence lasted until 1987, when renovation work at Saint-Nazaire Cathedral accidentally uncovered the sealed chamber and its preserved evidence. Even then, the Catholic Church initially attempted to prevent full investigation of the findings. Only sustained pressure from academic institutions, human rights organizations, and the French government forced complete disclosure of the Carcassonne materials. The 1987 discovery also revealed that the December 15th incident wasn't the end of Verdale's influence, but rather its transformation into something even more insidious. Hidden compartments in the cathedral contained correspondence showing that several of Verdale's planned experiments were continued by other Church officials who had learned of his work before his death. These successor programs, operating with greater secrecy and institutional support, conducted human experimentation well into the 15th century. Today, the site of Saint-Nazaire Cathedral houses a memorial to the 47 known victims of Verdale's experiments, though historians believe the actual number of deaths may have been significantly higher. The memorial includes not just the names of identified victims, but also a comprehensive exhibit detailing how the church's cover-up enabled decades of additional atrocities. The blood covenant of Carcassonne forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between knowledge and morality, between institutional authority and individual conscience, and between historical progress and human dignity. In our modern world, where medical research continues to push ethical boundaries and religious institutions still struggle with accountability, the lessons of 1348 remain disturbingly relevant. As we've seen, the quest for knowledge, even knowledge, that could save lives, becomes monstrous when it treats human beings as expendable resources rather than individuals deserving dignity and protection. Bishop Arnaud de Verdale began his journey believing he was serving God and humanity. But his willingness to sacrifice others for what he saw as a greater good transformed him into something far more dangerous than the plague he sought to defeat. The true horror of Carcassonne isn't just that it happened, but that it was systematically covered up, institutionally continued, and historically forgotten until archaeological accident forced us to confront the truth. In the end, the blood covenant of Carcassonne reveals that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are those who believe their monstrosity serves a higher purpose. What does this forgotten chapter of medieval history tell us about our own willingness to overlook institutional crimes when they serve causes we support? And how many other historical atrocities remain buried beneath official narratives designed to protect powerful institutions rather than honor their victims? If this investigation into the darkest corners of medieval Europe has shocked you as much as it shocked me during my research, I'd encourage you to share this video with others who need to understand how easily moral authority can be corrupted when institutions prioritize their own survival over truth and justice. Subscribe for more deep investigations into history's hidden horrors, and let me know in the comments. What other covered-up historical events do you think deserve this kind of detailed examination?